much. The sound of Syrian opposition forces seizing a strategic town from government forces in the western coastal province of Latakia today. Well, with the brief pause in Syria's fighting now a distant memory and the international diplomatic process all but non-existent, what hope is there of making any kind of progress on the ground in Syria? The Obama administration is apparently considering closer cooperation with Moscow. It's been reported in Washington that the US may offer to help Russia in the fight against militants from the so-called Islamic State and other al-Qaeda-affiliated groups, provided that the Russians stop targeting civilians and persuade the Assad government to follow suit. Charles Lister is Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington and author of The Syrian Jihad, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Evolution of an Insurgency. So, is this proposal any more likely to get Russia on side than previous attempts?
I don't think it's realistic to work. I don't think it's more likely to, but I think there is a feeling that there is a real need to get Russia more on board. I mean, I don't think it comes as news to anyone that the situation in Syria is rapidly deteriorating again. Syrians themselves feel increasingly desperate and resentful at the international community's failures to help solve the situation there. And I think there is a grudging acceptance that Russia has stepped in to a vacuum and given itself a certain amount of superior power and influence over the dynamics in Syria. But by extension, there is a desperate need to get Russia to play a more constructive role. And on the other side, of course, it's important to note that Moscow itself has, from the very get-go, had as one of its preeminent objectives here to stand up on the international stage as an acknowledged constructive partner in helping to solve Syria. So I think the US is attempting politically here to call Russia's bluff and to say, okay, you want to be a helpful actor in Syria, well, here you go, here's a potential deal on the table, but before we get there, you need to prove that you're actually willing to do what you've offered to all along.
In practical terms, if this was taken up by Russia, what difference would it make on the ground?
I mean, certainly the chatter amongst policy circles here in Washington, D.C. is that the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, is gaining strength on a day-to-day basis. And that needs to be more and more of a focus in terms of our policy on Syria. So in an ideal world, there would be an increased level of intelligence sharing such that a more effective military campaign could be launched against Jabhat al-Nusra. Now, speaking as, above all else, a terrorism analyst, I think this is an extremely bad idea. I actually think a military campaign, whether it's run by Russia and or America or both, would actually result in exactly the opposite results that we would be aiming for.
So from your point of view, even if the diplomatic process was moved forward, actually, in practical terms, it might have a negative effect.
Yeah, I mean, we have to acknowledge that this group, Jabhat al-Nusra, has spent the past 5 years very carefully and delicately embedding itself within opposition revolutionary dynamics. And it's done this precisely to protect itself against a scenario like this. So when the US initiated airstrikes against the Islamic State in September 2014, it also carried out some strikes against Jabhat al-Nusra, claiming that they were plotting attacks abroad. Now, when that happened, the immediate reaction within the broader mainstream opposition was to declare these strikes counter-revolutionary. And if anything, it brought the opposition much closer with this al-Qaeda affiliate. Now, I fear the situation over the last 2 years has become even more intense on the battlefield, such that that kind of closening between these two ideological actors would be even more intense. And unfortunately, Jabhat al-Nusra is an organization we can only really counter by expanding and strengthening our relationships with the more moderate opposition actors on the ground, and most importantly, by actually de-escalating the conflict on the ground and by making the political process that much more meaningful than it has been up until today.
Is there any argument for the situation on the ground perhaps being worsened in the short term if it actually brings about a longer-term rapprochement with Russia that could see a wider agreement at some point in the future?
Yes, I mean, I actually do buy the argument that Russia has interests to gain just as much as it has to lose. And so there is an extent to which we could call Russia's bluff. So in that way, I would advocate placing much more overt pressure on the Assad regime and giving prior warning to the Russians of doing so. My personal belief is I don't think the Russians would react to a more aggressive US policy. I think there's no way Moscow has it in its interests to find itself in a war with America. The unfortunate reality is, I think in Washington, Washington right now, we don't have an administration that is willing enough to escalate in order to de-escalate. And I think that rule does stand by. I think there is promise there. But as I say, I don't think we're going to be seeing that anytime soon.
Charles